Let's assume we want to create the user interface library. We'll allow the programmers to create a set of widgets or UI objects. For our example, let's focus on one of these widgets, namely the text box. The text box allows the user to enter some text over multiple lines. In some cases, we allow the user to type on after they filled the text box. If we do, we should probably have a variant of the text box that allows for scroll bars. These scroll bars would allow the user obviously to scroll up and down and see the text that is outside the window designated. Let's say we want to create a class that can do that, and perhaps we create a special kind of class for the widget. Maybe we will call this something like text box with scroll bar. Someone else want to also have something like a border or a double border around. Perhaps we create this class something like text box with scroll bar and double border. And you see the problem here is that we have scroll bars and borders, and these are independent dimensions. If you want independent features, we might, for instance, also introduce shading. The number of subclasses of the text box would just explode exponentially with the number of factors that we come up with. If we went back to the 80s and even the 90s, designers often tried to fit all these variations into hierarchies of classes. We may, for instance, have a base class called widgets, and then we have a subclass called text box, and then we get all these variations of text boxes underneath. Modern designers usually do better than this, and we hardly ever see these design constructs anymore. Remember that the Design Patterns book was written back in 1994. And at that point, using class hierarchies to solve these type of problems were very common. The decorator pattern is a great way to solve this problem without introducing a combinatorial number of specific classes. One of the beauties of the decorate pattern is also that the features can be added dynamically at runtime. Let's first think about this conceptually. If we have a client with a text box, what he wants is for the scroll bar and double border to be added rather than to think of it as a completely new type. In fact, we want to dynamically introduce perhaps a scroll bar at the point when the user has typed too much text, or we might want to introduce the double border to show selection of a text box. So it's more of a combinatorial thing. It is also worth noting that these things that we add to the text box could be potentially reusable. We could, for instance, use the scroll bar somewhere else. There wouldn't be much difference for a scroll bar for a text box versus, say, a scrollable picture for pictures that are too big to fit into a frame. We also want for these features to be runtime extendable, so that a user or the text box could add these features whenever they feel it's essential to have them. Let me create a new picture where I'll show you the decorator pattern applied to the text box. Let's say we have a client that at runtime creates a text box. The client can now start adding content to the text box. I'll draw what that might look like on the right-hand side. Let's say we have a box that contains the text, and as we're adding content, we'll keep on displaying that content inside the rectangle. However, at some point, we might go beyond the designated area for the text box. And as soon as we do, we need to add a scroll bar. We want the scroll bar to be added, but we don't want to change the type of the text box. The decorator pattern suggests a way of doing this. Now let's assume that the client is using some objects, so we can just draw the text box object and the reference from the client to the text box. What the decorator pattern suggests is that we introduce a new object that sits between the client and the text box that is responsible for rendering the scroll bar. Now, don't worry too much right now of how that gets injected. I'll give you a couple of alternatives for that later. But just notice that now, whenever the client is using the text box, they actually go through the scroll bar before they get to the text box. This is an interesting way of doing things because the scroll bar gets to, for instance, render its area on the screen and then maybe narrows down the size that is now available for the text box to render. In our example with the scroll bar, it would be natural that the text box itself injects the scroll bar. Let's look at a different example where it might be equally natural that the extended functionality is added by a client. If we wanted to add a border to the text box, it would be natural that the client requests this. The mechanism would be the same though. What we would do is we create a border renderer in front of the scroll bar renderer in front of the text box. This way we can chain together different features for a widget. In this case, we're using the text box, but you can probably see that we could have done exactly the same for a picture. We call these extensions for decorators. They were introduced dynamically and they're potentially reusable.